This week on Straight Talk.
Every season offers a different opportunity to see something beautiful out here.
You don't have to go far in the Pacific Northwest to find natural beauty. National parks across Oregon, Washington, and Idaho attract millions of visitors a year.
Have a place where this is easily accessible to visitors and they can see a nice variety and diversity of some of the native plants of the area.
Now, as tourists look ahead to the busy summer season, the national park system is seeing changes in resources and leadership as plans to cut federal spending ramp up.
DOGE, which is now waging war on government waste, fraud, and abuse, and Elon is doing a really good job.
We sit down with the former director of the National Park Service to discuss the impact to America's public lands.
No rangers means less rescue. No rangers means more destruction to our fragile public land.
The stories and history the parks share.
The National Park Service and their mission is all about protection, preserving, and enhancing our natural resources and our cultural resources together.
And what made his time leading the service historic. That's right now on Straight Talk. Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Stephanie Domerat. On this week's episode, we are talking about America's public lands. Across the U.S., there are 63 national parks and more than 430 park sites that attract more than 300 million visits each year. Some in the Pacific Northwest include Washington's Mount Rainier, Oregon's Crater Lake, along with the Fort Vancouver Historical Site and John Day fossil beds. Now we're seeing changes in the park system, from its leadership to its planned funding and workforce. And today we sit down with the former director of the National Park Service, Charles Sams III, the first Native American to be appointed to the role. Chuck was sworn into office under the Biden administration in 2021. Before that, he served as Governor Brown's appointee to the Pacific Northwest Power and Conservation Council. And prior to joining the council, Charles served as executive director for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. Just last month, he was appointed back onto that Power and Conservation Council by Governor Tina Kotek. Now, Chuck, thank you so much for being here. You drove all the way from Eastern Oregon. I'm so happy to be able to meet you.
Well, thank you, Stephanie.
Yes, I was able to meet you at an event last year, but it's so great to see you again in person. First, you just returned to Pendleton a few months ago from Washington, D.C. So how is it being home in Eastern Oregon?
You know, I was born here in Portland and raised in Eastern Oregon. It is always fantastic to be back among my fellow Oregonians.
How's it been just getting used to being back in Oregon versus the big city and D.C. and Virginia?
You know, there was a long time ago I lived in New York City, and then I moved from New York to Lewiston, Idaho. I moved from the Beltway back to here, and you know, it's a lot slower pace,
yeah.
And so, but a lot more enjoyable.
Yeah, was it a homecoming of sorts when you returned?
Oh, absolutely. It's always humbling to come home, to go to be in Pendleton, where I grew up and where I have my friends and family, and to see people who just call me by your first name again, Chuck.
Yes, of course, Charles, but thank you for letting us call you Chuck here as well. How has your perspective changed coming back after serving as the director of the Park Service? I would imagine some perspective has changed and your eyes kind of open up in different ways.
You know, I spent a good portion of my career actually throwing rocks at the Department of Interior, pushing for better accountability, understanding, looking at ecosystem function, restoration of salmon here in the Columbia River Basin, and particularly throwing rocks at the Department of Interior, Fish and Wildlife, and National Parks. But now I served on the inside for 3 years, and it is a different perspective, and you understand a little bit better of the challenges the civil servants face in trying to implement policy.
What were some of those things that you faced that you may not have known before?
You know, when I look and see just the timelines it takes in moving anything through Washington, D.C., you know, it is called a bureau for a reason. It's bureaucratic. But that being said, one of the things I came in deep appreciation with was the staff and the civil servants who've served year after year, ensuring that they are fulfilling the obligations that were set out by Congress and by the President.
When you say that you were throwing rocks at the Department of Interior, what do you mean by that?
You know, when you're looking at and really trying to fight about what ecosystem function should look like back in the Pacific Northwest, what are we doing around salmon and watershed restoration? Are we funding it to the best of our ability? Many times, you know, sitting down and arguing with assistant secretaries, deputy secretary and secretary of Interior in my jobs over the years, and now being on the inside and understanding what some of those limitations may be when you're a civil servant and even when you're a political appointee.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Okay, and speaking of all the things that are happening on the inside, and also let's talk about what's happening today. So we're seeing some changes at the federal level and at the parks right now. President Trump's agenda to cut federal spending means downsizing, and that includes the Park Service. In February, the administration fired about 1,000 newly hired permanent workers who clean and maintain the parks as well as educate visitors. About 50 of those workers were hired back. It was announced also that 7,700 seasonal workers would be hired, which was actually higher than the average in recent years. So what do you think about all this, and do you think this will have an impact on the parks?
Well, we're already seeing that's having an impact. At Yosemite, several of the campgrounds have already been closed down. We're seeing that across the park system, visitor centers being shut down, trails being shut down because there's just not enough staff currently in the parks to maintain those facilities and fulfill their obligation under the 1916 Organic Act.
So getting rid of permanent workers and hiring seasonal workers, what happens in that case?
You know, they'll be doing backfill, but you know, a lot of these permanent workers have years of history understanding of what it takes to maintain and protect. Not to say that our seasonal workforce in the National Park Service is anything wrong with them. They're also strong, but you're losing institutional knowledge. And when you lose institutional knowledge, you can make mistakes along the way. When
you heard about those cuts, was that something that seems like is cyclical, comes from time to time, or what was your reaction?
It was a little shocking. You know, over the last, over a decade now, national parks have seen a 20% increase in visitors into the parks. American citizens along with our international guests. This year alone, we saw, over 360 million visitors in 2024, a significant increase over 2023's numbers. And when you have that many people coming to the park, it's important that you staff the park correctly to ensure that you have enough folks to meet that demand. Over that same time period, National Park Service saw between a 16 to as much as a 20% reduction in their workforce. And so if you're not seeing and having enough people on the ground, you're going to start losing some of the capacity to maintain materials.
Are you saying that over the last few years we've already seen a decrease in workforce there in the National Park System?
We'd seen it over nearly a decade, but we were very fortunate under the Biden administration. President Biden was able to get the Inflation Reduction Act passed, in which $500 million was dedicated to the National Park Service so that we could hire nearly 1,700 staff to start filling that gap.
Okay.
Those 1,000 people that were let go were many of those national folks who had just started coming into the workforce.
I see, as part of that kind of just getting more workforce and more help. I'd imagine you're still in touch with people in the Park Service. What is the sentiment right now?
You know, I do hear from staff who are just very disheartened. Many of them have been career civil servants, you know, anywhere from 5, 10, 15, 20 years of working and dedicating to the National Park Service. There's an old saying in the National Park Service, you know, you're paid in sunrises and sunsets because it's not necessarily on par with what you could get in the private sector. People dedicate themselves to being of service to their fellow Americans, and they're willing to do it for less pay so that they can do this work. And so when they were let go, or they see this, folks are being let go of their friends, it can be quite disheartening.
I'd imagine as well, of course, the stated goal of President Trump and the DOGE goal really is to be more efficient, less wasteful. So when you were director, do you think that there were any inefficiencies or ways that spending could have been used better?
There are always ways that you can improve on government work. I'm generally a fiscal conservative as a Democrat. I come from Eastern Oregon, where we understand it's important that when you're spending a dollar that you're getting the maximum amount of services. So by example, as we were transitioning out of post-COVID, we came to the conclusion based on empirical evidence that we were getting really good workforce who were doing remote workers. So we were able to close down some of our regional remote offices and put people in more remote facilities, allowing them to work from home and be able to service 2, 3, or 4 parks rather than just one park. And that saved the American people money by being able to start consolidating some of those offices down. And then we just looked at other efficiencies. You know, did we have enough boots on the ground? As I already pointed out earlier, that we knew that we'd had a reduction in workforce. So how could we get more people out of regional and headquarters office and into the parks was a main stem and main work that we were doing to build in that efficiency.
Are there any other parts of these cuts that we're seeing or the reduction in spending that has made sense to you?
No, they seem to be a little bit scattered. You know, when you normally, my undergraduate degree is in business. And when, of course, they teach every person does business. And when in the last 30 years working in different forms of business, you take a very systematic approach when you're looking at an organization about efficiencies. Is there a need for a reduction? Is there a need for addition? Right now, all we're seeing are these reductions without any analysis, nor has there been any public facing of telling us why this is important, what it's going to do to improve services of what's happening on the ground in our national parks.
When you left your position, were there areas that you felt like really needed some effort as far as efficiency goes?
Oh, absolutely. You know, when we're looking across and seeing where we're spending in a park, it was important, and we were refocusing superintendents to look at their foundational documents to tell them what that park was set up to do and what they're doing to ensure that they're meeting that demand. Some parks are very historical in nature, and sure, they have natural resources that you have to maintain, but you need to focus on the historical aspect of the park. Some of our larger parks are actually more in the natural resource realm, like Yosemite, and so we need to be able to force maybe a little less interpretation and more on the natural resource protection. But you have to do that based on the foundational documents that set that park up.
From park to park?
From park to park.
It really varies. Okay. Well, currently there is no director of the National Park Service. There's an interim director. How do you think that leadership is going right now with all of these changes that are happening? You
know, I wish I could tell. You know, we're in a one-year cooling off period, so I'm not really able to talk to some of the leadership. Jessica was the comptroller while I was there, and she did a wonderful job. She's very conscientious, and I know she's a 17-year plus veteran of the National Park Service, and so I feel for her and the decisions that she has to make and render in order to serve the needs of the administration.
Let's talk about an executive order signed about a week ago. It's called, quote, Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History by Revitalizing Key Cultural Institutions and Reversing the Spread of Divisive Ideology. According to the White House, the order directs the Secretary of the Interior to restore monuments, statues, other markers that have been removed or changed in the last 5 years in the National Park Service. It also includes a review of any interpretive panels and exhibits, which are also a big part of, what the parks offer visitors. What were your thoughts when you heard this?
It seemed a little strange to me. The National Park Service works very, very hard to tell the depth and breadth of America's story. While I served, and under the leadership of Secretary Haaland and President Biden, we wanted to ensure every American saw a reflection of themselves in their national parks. So we were looking for stories that had maybe not lesser told or had been missed. And academic and research changes every year. And so the National Park Service is very fortunate that has both historians and social scientists that worked very, very hard to uncover those stories and go through a rigorous academic review before they publish and update panels and storytelling. And that was already going on. And so this seems to want to change the narrative, maybe that was already out there, and I'm not quite sure why, because that has already been the charge of the National Park Service under the 1916 Organic Act.
What new additions under your leadership could be impacted by this new order?
Well, when we're looking at the Emmett Till National Monument, there's two sites. There's one, of course, in Mississippi and one in Illinois, in Chicago. And how are we telling that story? It's not a good story of our past, but it's one that we need to learn from. And we need to understand, what lynching was like in the 1950s and the 1960s, and to recognize it only became a federal crime in the last few years. And it's a horrific story of America's past, and we can learn from that to ensure that we don't repeat it in the future.
And for people who aren't familiar, this was a national park site that opened in the last 5 years, right?
That's correct. It opened just a couple years ago and was signed in using the Antiquities Act and the President's power to create a new national monument.
And Emmett Till and his family, his mother, right, is what
Mamie
the exhibit's
Till
all
Mobley.
about. Mm-hmm.
Yes, Mamie Till Mobley was brave enough. Her son was killed by several gentlemen in Mississippi because he had supposedly whistled at a white woman. And his death was very horrific. And she was brave enough that when his body was returned to Chicago, that she had an open casket because she wanted the world to see what had happened to her son and what America was at that time period, and that we could and should be better.
And this is a new exhibit that was put into place under your leadership, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And this is one that could, you feel, potentially be changed or
taken away?
It could
be lessen the effects on it. I'm concerned just about what they want to do with that type of interpretation and the work that has already been done by historians over the last 50 plus years around this story.
We saw many public Confederate monuments and symbols removed or replaced following 2020. Were any of those on National Park Service lands?
Not Confederate. Especially since the parks were designed and set up predominantly by Congress, they have a mandate. And we pushed back in the National Park Service. If there are statues of Confederate officers and generals and enlisted men, it tells a story. It tells America's story. We still must tell both sides of that story. It's important that portions of history never get erased so that people can identify about what was going on at that time period and have a much fuller understanding of America and who we are.
So do you feel like this order is in response to that 2020 change in monuments and symbols and markers? Do you think it's related to that?
I do believe it's related to what happened in 2020, but I have confidence that the National Park Service has already been very, very careful about how they've responded to that and wanting to ensure that we don't erase any history from the National Park Service.
Okay. Thank you so much for being with us. We're going to take a quick break and we will continue our conversation right after this. Stay with us. And welcome back. We are continuing our conversation with the former director of the National Park Service, Chuck Sams III. Chuck, thank you again for being here. It's such an important topic and we appreciate you coming in.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yes. Well, of course, while you were the most recent director of the National Park Service, you were also the first Native American to lead and be in that position, which was a huge accomplishment, historic as well. You've also served as a tribal leader in the past, and the Department of Interior also oversees the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So speaking from that perspective, are there any DOJ cuts that have impacted Indigenous communities that you've seen in the last few months?
Yes, some of them have been reversed, but when you're looking at Health and Human Services, and the most current DOJ cut was on Head Start. Head Start affects everyone, and they're currently getting rid of some of the regional offices. And having children who went through Head Start myself, it's important that portion of the education and fulfilling the obligations and the promise that the United States made to tribes, especially treaty tribes like my own, where they would provide those educational opportunities, I think are at risk now. And it's a recognition, though, as DOJ is getting rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that Native people are not part of that. The identity of American Indian is not one of an ethnicity, but one of a political entity and the obligations that the United States has with treaty tribes and tribes in general.
Have you seen any other direct impacts beyond the Head Start programs that could be?
There was some initially on the Health and Human Services. Most of those folks have been brought back, but there's still very strong concern about where they're closing that down. At Haskell University in Lawrence, Kansas, which is an all-American Indian college, my parents graduated from there, my brother graduated from there, they lost over 30 staff, many of them professors who now are no longer teaching there, and they have not been brought back. And that's a strong concern because, again, that's another educational component, but tribes who are sending their children to this university were looking for them to get a full education, and now they're not receiving that.
Let's speak to your time as Director of National Parks. One of the priorities you had was to be a voice for Indigenous people and also help tell their stories. Do you feel like you accomplished that?
I think we made some really great strides. There was a better understanding of fulfilling the trust responsibility that the federal government has to tribal nations. In talking to staff, we all take an oath of office when you become a civil servant to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. And in that Constitution, it says the president can make treaties from time to time, and treaties under federal law are the supreme law of the land that even supersede the Constitution. And there are over 370 treaties with tribes all across the United States in the over 570 tribes that currently exist. And so it was explaining to the staff that when they took their oath of office, they're obligated to fulfill that trust responsibility. I was surprised to learn that many staff had never been told that in their career, that was their obligation. And so towards that end, we talked more about co-management and co-stewardship of national parks. We had over 150 different agreements with tribes all across the United States in over 150 different parks in which tribes were bringing their traditional ecological knowledge, their indigenous knowledge to the table because all science is based on observation. And it was an opportunity for them to show and demonstrate what they've learned over a millennia of how better to preserve and protect these lands as we're responsible to do under the Organic Act of 1916.
What were you most proud of, you think, in your time as leadership?
You know, there's a lot to be proud of. Mostly it was working with the staff directly. Coming out of COVID, there was already a lot of demoralization, and I'm very concerned about the demoralization they're currently facing. The staff worked very, very hard to start a new initiative that they called RISE, to be respectful, inclusive, safe, and engaged workforce. And it was a recognition that the staff wanted to be better respected at all levels, whether you were a first year, a seasonal ranger, or you were a 30-year plus veteran. It wanted to make sure that they were inclusive of all different perspectives and ideas coming to the table. So again, all more Americans could see a reflection of themselves. And it wanted to be safe. You know, what are the safety protocols we're doing? And then we're not just talking about physical safety, we're talking about mental safety. And we had the first mental safety stand down, psychological safety stand down ever in the Park Service to help people deal with any mental issues and what services are available. And we wanted an actively and engaged workforce who showed up every day wanting to bring their ideas to the table.
What is something that you think all Americans can learn from Native Americans when it comes to their views on public lands and nature?
You know, I was very fortunate to grow up here in Oregon and more importantly on the Umatilla Indian Reservation. It taught me a strong land ethic that if you take care of the land, it will take care of you. And so understanding that there's a reciprocal relationship with flora and fauna, with the land and the water, those values and understanding and the relationship that I'd had with the natural world, I wanted to impart on the staff who were responsible for natural and cultural resource protection. Many times it's seen that natural resources and cultural resources protection are two different things. They're actually the same thing because humans are an important part of the ecosystem. Humans have a symbiotic relationship with the natural world. And that relationship that I learned on the Umatilla Indian Reservation from my elders was carried through into the National Park Service.
Let's talk about the future of public lands, future of the National Park Service. What do you hope the future looks like?
You know, there is some concern. They're looking at potentially selling off some of our national public lands. These lands were set aside already by folks, you know, who have long left. But they took a vision that said, you know, we need to set these lands aside for ourselves. We need to set these lands aside to protect our natural resources. We need to set these lands aside to tell the story of who we are. And so I'm very concerned about how we are going to go forward to ensure we protect and preserve these lands and not sell them off to private interests, to ensure that these lands are preserved in perpetuity as they were set out to do under congressional action from years past, and that we have a longer vision of what public lands mean to us as people and to us as American citizens.
I recently read that most people who visit the National Park Service or the parks are white. Why is that, do you think, and is there a way to make it more inclusive for everyone to feel like they want to visit?
You know, I saw the same data, but at the same time, I spent a lot of time in the parks. I was very, very fortunate to visit over 120 parks in a little over 3 years as the director. And I actually saw all kinds of people in the parks from all different backgrounds and all different races. And it was always exciting to see. I think as we ensure that people know that these parks are theirs and that they have a right to them, I think that's the education part we need to do to ensure that we see more diversity in the parks themselves, of people coming into the parks. But over the last 3 years, I saw a lot of different folks from all different cultures and backgrounds coming into the park. And it was always exciting to see them bring their children and the next generation, or to bring their elders into the park with them and show them around. A couple of years ago in Yosemite, while walking on a trail on National Trails Day, it was just exciting. I heard over a dozen different languages spoken on the trail that afternoon.
For people who may not have visited National Park Services or sites or as much as they may want to, what would you say to them about the magic of them?
You know, the parks belong to you, the American people. It is what we've done. We've set these lands aside for ourselves to enjoy, to experience, to learn. And whether you're looking at sites along the East Coast and visiting Revolutionary parks or Civil War parks, or you're out here visiting Oregon caves, it has a deep story to tell. One of the things I'm most proud about Oregon is the arrowhead, the patch that identifies you as a National Park Service employee, was designed and created at Oregon caves. And it's the patch that's been around for over 50 years now as the symbol of the National Park Service.
That's incredible. I didn't know that.
Yes.
That's awesome. Well, I love that, and just in time for the summer season, and people can look ahead to seeing our beautiful nature in our own backyard. So Chuck Sams, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Stephanie. It was a joy.
Really appreciate having you. And thank you so much for watching. Coming up next week on Straight Talk, we sit down with Portland Mayor Keith Wilson as he marks 100 days in office in an entirely new form of government. And a reminder, if you ever miss an episode of Straight Talk or you want to go back and re-watch one, you can stream Straight Talk on your own schedule anytime. You can just download our free TV app, KHW+. It's available now on Roku, Apple TV, and Fire TV. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.